Welcome everybody to Office Hours number 16. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to go through our regular topics today, and then we're going to touch on a few discussion points, timely stuff that's been discussed in the town halls and some of the other meetings over the last week or so. So just to kick things off, a short one, I guess, this week on Watch. The only update that I have seen is Aragon upgrading to a 4th of May alpha. Trace features are now enabled by default, so you don't need to add an option to your startup anymore in order to get the trace feature working, but obviously you still need to turn that feature on in your RPC daemon when you spin that up. And if you're going to run the latest version, you need to, I believe, do a full resync as well. Now, last week we talked a bit about using the RPC test tool, which comes with Aragon, to compare the results that are coming for trace transactions and comparing them in Aragon and Open Ethereum at the same time. And I did a quick test this morning just to check, and nothing has actually changed in that regard. Using the set of blocks that Chris defined a few weeks ago, we still have a difference between the outputs that come from from Aragon and from Open Ethereum. I know that over the last week as well, there's been a lot more activity in the TurboGeth channel on the Discord. People are starting to experiment with the new Aragon client on the testnet and are seeing some interesting behavior varying from, obviously, Trace is not working correctly, and also a lot of issues around the way that the client works around the chain head, and noticing that their indexers under certain situations are 50 or so blocks behind. I don't know if anyone who's been doing those experiments is on here. Alex, have you been doing anything on testnet with with Aragon?
No, not yet. I was about to connect it today to see how it goes.
Okay,
but
Chris, I know that
our node is in full sync. We can probably just start with live peer because it's a small subgraph. I can have some results later today.
Chris, I know that you started looking at it in testnet. What's your observations been so far?
Yeah, roughly reflecting other people's observations in the TurboGeth channel here in the Graph Protocol Discord, particularly with subgraphs that require trace support. It seems to lag behind roughly 50 blocks, and subgraphs not requiring trace support generally seem to work the same way as they do when indexing against Open Ethereum. But yeah, generally I would say the performance of the client has been good, and I haven't noticed any issues crop up.
So in terms of some of the, I guess, unofficial announcements that have come out so far, someone correct me if I'm wrong, there was an initial announcement put out by the Open Ethereum team around sunsetting Open Ethereum. So I wasn't sure if that had remained public. Did they republicize that plan? I think Cohen actually might have spoken to one of the teams. Does anyone have any clarification on what's happening with Open Ethereum in terms of sunsetting after one of the next upgrades, or maybe after I don't know, ETH 2? Does anyone know when they're planning to actually sunset the client?
I believe the hard fork that comes after London. I forget the name.
Shanghai,
right.
Maybe something like that.
So that can't be that far away, right? And we certainly cannot be in a position where we have unsupported software and no other alternatives by the time that comes along. So I'm wondering, how we more proactively interact with Alexei and the rest of the Aragon team around these sort of issues that we're seeing, and how we don't want to bombard him and the team with the same issue 100 times over, but I think we need to collectively come together describe the issue that we're seeing on testnet or set of issues, and then present them to the Aragon team.
Totally agreed. Maybe it makes sense to kind of coordinate that within the Graph protocol community. Try and, collect all of the indexer folk that are testing Aragon together and kind of centrally reporting those issues and liaising with the team that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So we'd have a group of people. It'll be the people who are active in the TurboGeth channel today, basically, and anyone else who wants to contribute. And that will need to be a separate, there's enough there for that to be a separate call with those people to get the issues down on paper and then present them to the Aragon team. But sort of related to that issue, I also wanted to see if anyone was interested in discussing sort of, the idea of only being, of only having one client really to depend on kind of worries me, and certainly the transition period worries me as well. I'm just wondering how other people feel, apart from being relieved that potentially in the future, in the near future, you might go from having to need 8 or 9 terabytes to 1 or 2 terabytes. But what about the case for client diversity and things like this? Is it a better situation for us as indexers if we have one node implementation that we run, or is it a worse situation for us from a decentralization point of view?
Well, I know what Yanis said. He prefers to have one reliable software stack that just works. It doesn't affect decentralization, to be honest. I mean, depending on how you look at it, but...
Well, I mean, I can't entirely agree with you there, because diversification is part of the, there's sort of like the remit of decentralization, and one of those things is diversity in the clients. You look at, what they're doing in ETH2, and there's like, I don't know how many clients now, 7? There's a lot of clients for ETH2, and there's a reason for that. I just worry that we end up in a situation where something fundamentally breaks with the one client that we have, and we have no other other options. I mean, that's kind of where we are today, right? I'm just thinking about the future, especially around Ethereum. That's just going to get busier and busier, and then we have layer 2 coming on top of that.
I would plus one. I think it's a mixed bag. I can see how, rallying the entire kind of graph software stack around a single client does make things like determinism a lot easier. And anybody that's been engaged in the protocol discussions that have been happening knows that determinism is one of the most challenging aspects to get right in the protocol, and really important to get right. So for that reason, less clients makes that problem easier. But I think if you're taking a more holistic perspective, it's not a good thing. It creates a centralization of control and development around clients that are used to access Ethereum. And I think it also creates complacency. It's a good thing when we have multiple teams pursuing different approaches in terms of innovation and pushing the protocol forward from the kind of implementer perspective, with their own vision of it, and in that sense, I think diversification is a really positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's kind of my main concern. Seb, you got something to say there?
Yeah, I see a future where we get into serious performance issues with those RPC interfaces, and that it will eventually be beneficial when the graph stack moves closer to the ETH node. Maybe I can imagine that. Let's say I'm not expecting this to happen, but completely. But having some reference RPC ETH node implementation that can also be rolled out to networks like BSC or Matic would make a lot of sense because you have to deal with far less bugs. You can tailor it to the RPC codes that will be expected. And in the end, you probably would have to maintain less software as Agent Node or Graph Foundation when you go this way.
So I guess the question there is more it's around incentives, right? So is it just the graph that is really at the forefront of, you know, hammering trace calls on ETH nodes and really pushing the performance barrier on how, you know, how fast you can sync complex subgraphs? Or are there other teams out there as well that, you know, are very heavy users of the nodes, and we could look at, you know, incentivizing around groups of, you know, network participants rather than just the graph?
I don't want to get too far off topic, but you know, it is interesting that I think the graph is probably one of the heaviest use cases, kind of sitting on top of an ETH node. And certainly as the kind of just sheer throughput of data ramps up over time, I think, you know, much more broadly, we need a better standard for consumers of ETH node data to fetch that data from ETH nodes. JSON RPC sucks, right? Like, the costs of serializing and deserializing JSON string data are mad. And if we could move more holistically to a standard that was based on protobufs or some other binary messaging format that was, you know, way more efficient, I think that would unlock very significant performance gains for use cases like indexing. But obviously, you know, what we're speaking about here is way beyond the context of just Graph protocol.
Yeah, but like you said, I think Graph is sort of at the forefront of this. So a lot of the incentive is sort of biased. It's not biased, but it's on our shoulders, right, to potentially to break these barriers.
One example from the TurboGas architecture, there is like this RPC and the node. There are two separate processes, right? And I saw that you have the option to let the RPC part answer or connect to the node part via shared memory instead of having some socket connection on the same machine, which shouldn't make that much of a difference, but they found performance improvements in certain cases when you just like directly connect them via shared memory. And this is like one performance optimization route that goes into the same direction as Chris just mentioned.
Interesting. Did I see somebody put their hand up there? If I missed you, put your hand up again. No, okay. Okay, well, we're about 20 minutes in, guys. Let's move on. That's an extended ETH node watch, I think. Seb, is there anything you want to bring up in Repo Watch this week specifically?
No, I looked at it, but there was not that much as I remember. Just this little bug fix release what was pushed out right after it switched to 0.15. Yeah, no, nothing really. What I wanted to ask is if anyone has played with Graphman and actually how to do it. Like which repository contains.
It's not implemented in the 0.22 release. It got added right after.
Okay, so it's just in master basically.
Yeah.
Cool. I think there will be nice things to play with soon.
Yeah, and there's something you missed though. I see a pull request opened 2 hours ago, which says stable cut for indexing in query rewards, which is massive.
Wow. Yeah, this I definitely missed. I was like 3 hours ago looking at it.
Yeah, I haven't dig too much into it. I'm not entirely sure what changes and what
Which
stuff.
repo is that?
Contracts.
Thanks.
Yeah, so this is the GIP that I think Ariel was talking about in the protocol town hall this morning, to have the more intuitive, effective, like indexing reward cut parameters.
About time, hey?
Yeah, I think this is going to save a lot of stress for delegators that then gets passed on to indexers long term.
Yeah.
Some people may not like it because they feel, I might be in that camp. Some people might not like it because they like the dynamic way that indexers can change their cuts, and they may feel that this is a very different network to a basic, transaction validation network, proof of stake network, where you're just validating transactions, so your commission is a very simple thing. But I think in the long run, the trade-offs are worth it, and to bring that number down to a simple dynamic number that everything in the background deals with the shifting of the levers, and that number remains static. I think that's a big plus, both for indexers that are managing that dynamically because of the gas costs, and of course the delegators, and then also the fallout from delegators because they don't understand why Payne changed his cut drastically because a large delegator left him, and the delegator felt like they were being cheated, whereas they were actually getting the same APY as they were before. So I think this is a very positive proposal or implementation at this point.
It will also make the cooldown periods more effective, like actually useful.
Yeah, that's a big thing for helping indexers sort of communicate their commitment to the network and communicate their commitment to delegators in terms of, I'm going to charge you this commission and I'm going to continue to charge that for, I won't be able to change that in the next 60 days or whatever, right? So is that going to be a rolling window now, Alex? I haven't looked into this in any detail yet.
Yeah, me neither. I saw it, I sent it to you on DMs, and that's about it. Like, didn't have the chance to go through the stuff too much.
Okay, so maybe next week we'll go, once it's, matured a little bit in everybody's minds, we can talk about it some more.
Yeah, sounds good.
I also think this is very beneficial for situations where you are running an indexer and you don't own the stake, because otherwise you always have to communicate back to the owner of the stake to set the delegation reward cuts.
Yeah, that's a pain in the butt.
And effectively, it's impossible to do this. So whenever someone runs an indexer with some VC stake, he basically has to set the fees to 100% and close that indexer for delegations, because otherwise there's too much interaction involved. And all those could now basically just open up and become like a full member of the network.
Yeah.
And I think there will be a lot of them, because now everyone wants to withdraw the indexer rewards without the thawing period. So a lot of big token holders, they prefer to stake instead of delegate now. I think it all comes together. It's like a beautiful development.
Another side benefit of the way that this is probably going to be implemented is that the reward cuts will be locked in at the time that the allocation is created. So even if you set your cooldown to 0, there'd be some greater level of predictability for the delegators that, it's really only new allocations created after the parameters change that would likely have different parameters enacted.
Right, that's interesting.
That is super. I think anything we can do to build protections into the protocol to prevent, delegators or generally participants in the protocol that are perhaps less deep in the weeds of it from, malicious or rug pull type behavior is awesome. So that's great to see.
Okay, let's move on to our migration section. We'll just touch on, where we are in the process right now. So on mainnet, the indexer release is up to 0.15.1, and it's been out for a week now. Most indexers should be upgraded by now. If anyone is struggling with that, now is a great time to ask questions. This, the original objective of this call was always to help indexers if they have basic all the way through to advanced indexer deployment questions or operational questions. If anybody has any of those questions, feel free to put your hand up. On testnet, after last week and my pleading for more testnet participants, I'm really glad to see that there's been a really a buzz of activity in the testnet channels, and especially around the studying of Aragon as a stake machine, and Chris from Torrential Finance and a few others are actively looking at what how Aragon performs on the testnet. In terms of where we are in the phases, we're in phase 2, quite clearly in phase 2. We've got queries coming in on mainnet. So if you haven't already upgraded, now's the time. Those are paid queries. And it's a good time to learn how to sort of run your indexer properly in a production environment. So I wanted to move on to, I have 3 main discussion points for the second half of the call. I haven't really put them in any particular order. I'm hoping that at least the second one segues into the third one. The first question, sort of an open question I wanted to bring up after having a discussion with Chris earlier today, was around non-determinism in general on the graph network, on mainnet. And the question that I've put down is, are non-deterministic subgraphs a time bomb on production? Are we asking for data integrity problems by serving these queries? Should we be indexing them at all? So that's my opening question. Chris, if you want to elaborate, since this was a discussion that started between me and you, and then we can go from there.
I'm going to start regret having these conversations with you soon. I guess, we were kind of having this conversation after the protocol town hall, and it's great to see the issue of determinism being taken so seriously, and obviously, in a protocol like this, it's really determinism that secures the integrity of the incentives, and I say that kind of mostly referring to indexing rewards, and the moment we introduce non-determinism, then the integrity of those incentives disappear, and we really create room for exploitation within the protocol, and really some participant being kind of left with the short end of the stick. I admit I have not read the kind of details of the GIP that deals with determinism and the kind of spectrum of determinism across the various features through their phases of being experimental and stable and so on. But yeah, I am a little bit concerned that determinism seems to be so fundamental to the healthy operation of the network, but at the same time we find ourselves a few months into mainnet, and we have non-deterministic subgraphs running, and those are actively being incentivized, and there's zero way to verify POIs or anything like that. I know Brandon's here, so I'm gonna let him speak.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in here since this is very relevant to the protocol town hall discussion this morning. So one thing I guess I'll clarify off the bat is that it's definitely not the goal for any feature of the subgraph API to be non-deterministic as like its long-term steady state, right? The discussion this morning was kind of more acknowledging this feature lifecycle that these features go through from a very practical R&D standpoint, that typically determinism is kind of like the last stage. And actually even looking to the future, right? This isn't something we've discussed a ton in public, but there's levels of guarantees even stronger than arbitration, right? So you could think of like something like, refereed game style verifiable computation, like what Arbitrum is doing, or you could even talk about zero knowledge proofs for, either queries or for indexing, and those would actually extend the feature development lifecycle, right? So it might be that like you get a feature to the point of determinism, but you haven't yet gotten into the point of, supporting refereed games or supporting zero knowledge proofs. And you could just see these things kind of progressing over time. And so instead of saying that like, it's meant to be binary, that either a feature is supported or not supported in the network, this is kind of just a way of sort of unlocking innovation and doing sort of progressive decentralization at the granular feature level rather than, only at the level of the protocol as a whole. I've got more to say there, but I'll pause for just thoughts and feedback on that.
So I imagine if we had that framework today, I guess we loosely do, but it's not sort of ratified. I'm thinking more about the present, right? About where we are now with indexers. If we had that list today and it just says non-determinate against these specific subgraphs, what's the rational thing for an indexer to do? Do we, my concern, and this is what I shared with Chris, is I understand that there are consequences potentially in terms of punishment of indexers, and then obviously follow on to their delegators if somehow something non-determinate causes an issue for the indexer syncing and delivering queries. But my biggest concern is delivering bad data to a consumer, and then the consumer makes a bad decision based on that data, right? That's a nightmare scenario. So when we think about right now with what we have today, which is, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, is it one non-deterministic subgraph, Omen?
I think it's more than one. I believe mstable is non-deterministic too. And the network subgraph as well, although I don't know if that's actively being queried at the network level.
Mstable shouldn't be, but the POIs don't match on chain for some reason. For Omen, all the POIs match with us, so something is going on with it.
Well, this is to do with what Brandon described, right? Brandon described that this is not a binary quality. This is a spectrum of features that fall either under or not under non-deterministic, right? So they're going to be different depending on what techniques, I guess, are being used within the subgraph. So again, just coming back to today, as a subgraph, as an indexer, do I want to take the risk that that data could be different to the data that another indexer serves and serve that data to a customer?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I did want to respond to a couple of things that you said that I think are relevant to that, which is that today, if you look at the network, there is one indexer already that's serving these sort of non-deterministic subgraphs, and that's the Edge Node indexer, right? That's been running in production for the last couple of years. And there's already a degree to which, the community and the ecosystem has basically, I guess you can think of it as a reputation system that allows people to trust those results. But it's a reputation system right now that kind of puts Edge Node in this privileged position. And part of what we're doing with this is acknowledging the role of reputation, as a sort of last line of defense and verifiability of results, and opening that up for more indexers to kind of develop reputation. So I think in past workshops, we've talked about like the indexer selection algorithm, which is this thing that the query engine runs to decide, what indexer to choose for a particular query. That thing is totally, the design space to that is totally open. And so one of the things we've defined for that actually is like a notion of reputation. The other thing is that the subgraph studio that's currently being developed by Edge and Node is part of like the gateway to the network that runs one of these query engines, also allows subgraph developers to specify indexers for particular sets of queries or subgraphs. Basically at the API key level, subgraph developers can specify which indexers they want to use. And so what those two things kind of open up is it puts the control in the subgraph developer's hand as to how they want to define, reputation for themselves. So it might be that, for non-deterministic subgraphs, or especially non-deterministic subgraphs that relate to important data, maybe the subgraph developer kind of handpicks, the set of indexers that they feel have like quote unquote good reputation. Edge and Node might be one of them. It could be, they can choose that based on any criteria they want. And then there might be a wider set of indexers that they use for deterministic subgraphs, or subgraphs that are using like less mission critical data. And so I think it's just important to acknowledge that like we're in a state today where reputation is already a core part of users' trust assumptions, but it's just right now only being directed at Edge and Node. And I do think it's important that more indexers have the opportunity to develop those reputations in the interest of decentralization, and then also being pragmatic with the feature development lifecycle.
So when you say reputation, this is a metric, is it, within the utility score of an indexer, or is it softer than that? Like, is that community? Are you thinking community reputation, sort of, rather than programmatic reputation?
It can be either, right? So in the case of like a subgraph developer using Subgraph Studio to like allow list a set of indexers for a given API key, that's more of a manual process. And, you could imagine that developer going through any number of heuristics to decide, what makes a reputable or trustworthy indexer. You can also do this programmatically in the query engine itself, and that might be looking at things like, how long has the indexer been participating in the protocol? How many query fees have they collected on deterministic subgraphs over a certain period of time? And that reputation doesn't need to necessarily be global. It actually can still be quite useful being local, because the reputation that indexers develop acts as an additional form of Sybil resistance on top of the stake that they've allocated in the protocol. So like if a indexer, for example, burns their local reputation with a number of subgraph developers or query engines, let's say for the sake of this discussion, it's very difficult for them to spin up a new reputation and say, okay, well, I'm going to try and cheat those same query engines from a new identity, because reputation in some ways is even more Sybil resistant than just the staked tokens, which could be bought on an exchange and staked in real time, right? A track record of active and honest participation in the protocol can really only come with a lot of time and effort.
Brandon, just to clarify, in this context, we are talking about this subgraph developer as a consumer of that data. When you speak about generating an API key.
Yeah, so the reason I use query engine is because it is a bit confusing who this refers to. So today in the network, realistically, most subgraph developers will use a gateway to build their dApps to access the decentralized network. And that gateway is running what's called a query engine. And for the sake of the protocol economics and design, that query engine plays the role of a consumer. The long-term goal of the graph, the vision, is that end users become the consumer and the counterparty in all these interactions, and that query engine is running on the end user's device or browser or dApp wallet. But that's not where we're at today. So yes, today when I say the consumer or the query engine, I'm referring to the subgraph developer parameterizing this query engine that will be run on behalf of their end users.
Right, that makes total sense. An indirect consumer.
Exactly.
But how far is this vision out? Like, right now there's only one consumer, and when we introduce this trust score, then we kind of raise the barrier of entry, and the fix for this problem of centralization in this case would be that the client, like the final consumer, selects himself via software, but how far is this goal realistically out, since we are kind of introducing centralization for the next couple of years, I guess. I kind of see a problem there, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess there's different ways of looking at this. I personally wouldn't describe it as introducing centralization. I actually think it's essentially reducing centralization that exists today by edge and node sort of monopolizing the notion of reputation. This is expanding it to a wider set of indexers. Just if you take it as a precondition that there's going to be some subgraphs with non-determinism, then the question is, do you want those non-deterministic subgraphs to just run on edge and node infrastructure? Or would you like those subgraphs to also be in the network where indexers have the chance to develop reputation in a decentralized way? Certainly, I think it's better for subgraphs to be deterministic. It removes this question altogether of having to figure out how to define reputation, and makes it practical for a even wider set of indexers to index those subgraphs. So I very much think that is the goal, and so I don't want to take away from that. This is just more of a question of, for that long tail of non-deterministic subgraphs, or the subgraphs that are using features that are early in the development life cycle, what's the story there? Is it just an edge and node thing, or is it something where the entire network can participate? As for your first question around like the timeline for consumer query engines, I would say it's probably at least a year out, partly because this isn't just the roadmap to getting there isn't just like a graph story or an edge and node story, right? Like this is going to be part of the story for fully decentralized internet applications as a whole. So protocols like LivePeer will need the same thing. Any really infrastructure protocol will need these sorts of primitives to exist. And we're still seeing a lot of those building blocks fall into place, right? Like we don't even really have wide scale state channel consumer wallet adoption, in dApp browsers or, wallets. So there's a number of like building blocks in the ecosystem that we're trying to support, in all the ways that we can. But I suspect realistically many of them won't fall in place towards the end of this year or next year. And then I think we can see more experimentation themselves.
What's the estimate, like how many percent of the subgraphs are non-deterministic, and what makes them non-deterministic typically?
Yeah, so it's a bit idiosyncratic what makes them non-deterministic. I can give you to idiosyncratic, I mean to the specific feature. I can give you like one example, which would be like the network subgraph today, right? We have this network subgraph that uses data from IPFS, and IPFS data, even though it's itself immutable, right? You can reference an IPFS file by its content hash. The availability of that file in the network is not deterministic, right? Files can become available or unavailable. They can get unpinned. There can be network partitions. So this is a problem, for example, that affects the graph network subgraph. It affects, some of the NFT subgraphs that, like, at the time that an indexer, indexes an NFT subgraph, maybe the file with the metadata for that NFT or a certain NFT was not available. And then, later it becomes available and another indexer sees it, right? So this is the way that like IPFS data sources, work in subgraphs today, for example. There's a whole design, actually I think there's an RFC or there's not yet a GIP for it that I can find that talks about refactoring that, and basically it isolates the IPFS file from the Ethereum mapping, so that the Ethereum mapping can kind of progress deterministically, and then you can kind of have these IPFS dynamic data sources that run concurrently, and then you need some source of truth for the availability of those files. So examples of this would be something like an Arweave or a lazy ledger. So this is just one subgraph feature we're talking about, right? Like there's a number of, dozens of different subgraph features, but this gives you a flavor for the type of design thinking that goes into making sure that this feature that, has existed in subgraphs for a while actually works in a way that's fully deterministic in a decentralized context.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because it sort of outlines and emphasizes the fact that there are all these problems that are still to be solved. And time is needed to solve them. And I think that really plays into the importance of the framework that you're working on, Brandon, around feature sets. And understanding, it certainly helps for indexers to also understand why, like you gave us an example there, to understand why there is currently no solution for one specific problem with non-determinism. And also how it also segues into the gateway itself, right? So there's many parts of the gateway that we're still, I guess, trying to come up with solutions for. Zach on his cost modeling workshop talked about, how we haven't solved for the open market side of the query market. We have to experiment as indexers to sort of search for, reasonable prices that consumers might tolerate. So it's all sort of drawing into the same theme, which is there's all these complex problems for decentralization that are still to be solved. Okay, we have 15 minutes left. I have a couple of this discussion topics. The next one might take up the full 15 minutes, which is fine.
Jim, do we definitely want to? I have one question for Brandon on the deterministic stuff. Can I go ahead?
Sorry, did you not hear that? Go ahead. Is my mic working?
I didn't hear that, but now I did. So, thanks. So yeah, Brandon, in your first comment, you kind of asked for general feedback about the spectrum of features and recognizing that, if we have the expectation that every feature that makes it into the network is fully deterministic, we're going to move at snail's pace, and that's just not realistic. And I completely agree that makes sense. What I got from listening to you in the protocol office hours was that for features that haven't yet reached full determinism, it may make sense to toggle the incentives off. And I first just want to verify that understanding is correct.
Yeah, that's correct. So specifically for features that don't support deterministic indexing, indexing rewards would be toggled off. That would be handled partly by indexers themselves submitting 0 POIs. It would also partly be handled by the subgraph oracle disabling indexing rewards on those subgraphs once it detects them.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. And kind of, Jim, we touched on this in our chat where, the major concern of non-determinism and the determinism kind of securing the integrity of incentives disappears if we take those incentives away. And so that way, the kind of economic exploit associated with non-determinism disappears. So that's cool. Does that mean that you see the kind of market stepping in and pricing in that risk within the query fee market, in kind of recognition that there is no determinism, so there is kind of no ultimate confirmation of, indexing or query validity, and so the market just gets to price that risk itself, and there are no indexing rewards?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, you're asking me to comment on something that's in some sense going to be emergent to the complex system that we've designed. I don't know if we'll see that query fees, query prices end up being higher on those subgraphs to compensate indexers for the lack of indexing rewards. You could also imagine query fees potentially being lower on subgraphs that are non-deterministic because people perceive the data as lower quality. It's really just hard to predict what consumer behavior might be. I think as Jim mentioned that Zach was referring to, eventually, one of the features on the roadmap for the Subgraph Studio is to, even before, query engines are being run in every consumer device, is to give dApp developers the ability to express preferences to that indexer selection algorithm. So we should start seeing, more we should start being able to observe some of that emergent behavior soon. But I think it's too early to comment on exactly what that's going to look like.
Makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Thanks from me too, Brandon.
Great discussion.
Absolutely.
So I guess we've probably got time for our 10 minutes to go on to the next one, which is again topics that come up when I talk to Chris and are on my mind as well and on the mind of many indexers. And Brandon has put together a nice forum post to sort of put his thoughts out there on network incentives today versus network incentives in the future and how we might mitigate issues with the balance of those things. So if you're okay, Brandon, maybe if you just want to sort of, I know you've put quite a lot of content together. If you were able to summarize, your thoughts on this, and maybe we go from there.
Sure. Yeah, it's a long forum post, so I'll try and share the thoughts, at least the problem at a high level, and maybe I'll pause just for comments on that. So I think the problems that I've heard identified at a high level are ones that we've been thinking about internally for a while, which is that, in the bootstrapping phase of the network, indexing rewards dominate query fees, right? By like probably a couple orders of magnitude at least. And so the question is like, what does that do to indexer behavior, especially when the marginal cost of serving queries in some ways is, if you were to just, if you look at, what's required to just submit correct proofs of indexing versus also serving queries, which requires, scalable query infrastructure. At EdgeNode, we've had this horizontally scaled query infrastructure. Obviously, we've dealt a lot with handling the load to our database, from handling high volumes of queries. There's the additional gas costs of, paying for the collect and claim transactions on chain. There's the, overhead of having to learn how state channels work and like the agoric cost model, and so on. There's kind of a number of these things. And so the risk just becomes that some indexers just quote unquote opt out, right? That they just say, hey, for the level of query fees, as they exist in the protocol today, it's just not worth it. I'd rather just collect indexing rewards. There's sort of a secondary problem that compounds, which is that the protocol economics today are designed such that indexers should allocate stake in rough proportion to the amount of query fees that they collect in the network. And the mechanism that enforces that, when there are indexers that, I'm just going to use the term lazy for convenience, it's not meant to be a pejorative, but like when there are lazy indexers that are not serving queries, that mechanism actually, essentially you can think of it as making queries more expensive for the network. And it's a little bit subtle how that happens, and I'd recommend reading the forum post on that. So I think there's a number of ways we could approach solving this problem, but I'll pause there just to make sure that there's kind of alignment on the problem itself.
Yeah, I think that sets it out pretty well. I don't want to dive into your solutions. That's where my questions really were. So this, a lot of what we're talking about here, essentially the punishment, so to speak, for those who are acting, I guess, in support of the network is via the revenue sharing mechanism, right? So, if you have an indexer who decides not to contribute any fees for queries or charge any, do any query service whatsoever, and they have a large stake on a subgraph, so if they were maybe a very large indexer, then that's going to have a very negative impact on the revenue of an indexer who doesn't have the ability to really analyze these things in detail, which maybe is a different question altogether around analyzing the actual the revenue share output. But I guess one of my concerns is that it's not just about making it easier and less to be an active, active both on the indexer reward and the query fee side, but it's also an economic question, right? So maybe they don't care whether they have it's no qualm to them whether it's complex or not to do query fees. It's all purely about money, right? So they may find that it's just it makes sense to just send the staking rewards for, ad infinitum. Who knows? I think the concern is that dynamic may not play out as we think it would, Brandon.
Yeah, so I think you have to look at the whole picture here. You're right. It's not just about the costs. It's not just about the marginal cost of serving queries versus not serving queries. It's also about looking at the marginal benefit of serving queries versus not serving queries. And, I guess like classic economics would say that as long as we make the marginal benefit of serving queries greater than the marginal cost of serving queries, then we would expect indexers to do it. And that should be true even regardless of the disparity of indexing rewards versus query fees. So while it might be true that it's still far more profitable to, collect indexing rewards, as long as the marginal benefit of also serving queries exceeds the marginal cost of serving queries, then we should still see a healthy amount of activity with respect to serving those queries. And actually, in the forum post that Jim was referencing, I basically break down, the high level strategies before going into solutions, and they kind of fall into one of three buckets. One is lowering the marginal cost of serving queries versus not serving queries. The other is increasing the marginal benefit of serving queries versus not serving queries. And then the third one, which is kind of maybe a counterintuitive, but it's actually increasing the cost of not serving queries. So basically increasing the cost to lazy indexers that only collect indexing rewards and don't serve queries. And then I think I've listed about 5 different concrete solutions that implement those one or more of those strategies. And I'm happy to dive into them if it's relevant, but I know we're pretty short on time.
Sure. I think go ahead, Oliver.
Yeah, I was curious. Is there possibly a fourth option here that could be lowering the benefits of not querying by addressing the indexer rewards?
I think that's the use it or lose it tax, right, Brandon? As I read it.
Yeah, I thought about listing that fourth one to complete the matrix because it's kind of a maybe more philosophical. Does increasing the cost of not serving queries? I guess you could also describe that as lowering the benefit of not serving queries. If you look at the net effect. But yes, you're right. You either increase the cost of not serving queries or decrease the benefit of not serving queries. And yeah, the use it or lose it tax basically aims to achieve that, which Jim just referenced and is one of the solutions outlined in the forum post.
I think the more open one of your solutions there proposed, Brandon, was the sort of the social engineering side of things. And in that solution, you talked about, delegators and indexers being aligned to the network, both financially and ideologically. So there are ways to sort of use the data that's coming out of the revenue share calculation to very clearly show who's contributing to the network and who isn't. And today, we have, one emergent KPI that people like to hang on to, APY. There's others that we've discussed in, in brief, like efficiency around GRT allocated. But maybe another one is a KPI around how effective they are with their stake. In fact, is that what staking efficiency is, Brandon? Staking intensity, sorry. Am I crossing my lines there?
Yeah, I don't know which dashboard you're referring to that was listing staking efficiency, but I did define a while back. I defined some KPIs that I referred to as staking efficiency that was basically looking at how optimally the indexer interacted with the various protocol mechanisms, and that also that part of that was looking at whether they were serving queries in rough proportion to the amount of allocated stake that they have. I don't believe that KPI has made it into any Edge and Node UI yet, but it's possible that that's made it into other UIs.
No, I've not seen it on any other dashboards yet, but I know it's in. Whether it's actually been calculated, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think it's a placeholder from when I put those designs together. But that is something that I would like to get better KPIs out there. I think that's something that we can do to just help delegators understand what makes a quality indexer. And Jim, I feel like you and I had this conversation a while back of like there's any number of reasons why we might want to as an ecosystem, leverage social engineering to encourage delegators to delegate to indexer exhibit like pro-social behavior that benefits the network as a whole, right? Like this is just one instance of that, but like there's many things that an indexer can do that really benefits the network as a whole. And there's, I think there's every reason to encourage delegators to use their power, yes, both to make a profit, but also to support the indexers that are really doing the most for the protocol. So yeah, I think this is a great example of that.
A minute left. Does anyone else want to add to this conversation? We have a new person on the stage. Taylor, welcome. Are you able to speak now? No? Taylor, if you want to DM me after this session and we can have a chat. But we're out of time, guys. I just want to thank you all for contributing today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Have a good
Thanks,
day.
everyone.
Thanks all.